A wealthy philanthropist offers a scholarship to a talented but impoverished student to attend an elite school. But she uses this to influence the boy in another way. What he discovers about her true intentions leaves everyone stunned. David stared at the letter in his hands, the heavy paper trembling slightly between his fingers. It was unlike anything he had ever held before, thick, elegant, and embossed with the gold crest of the Evans Foundation. The words on the page seemed almost too good to be true. Full scholarship awarded to David Carter, Elite Academy of the Arts. For a moment, he felt as though he were dreaming. The sounds of his cramped, noisy apartment faded into the background. The relentless hum of the city outside, the clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen, even the distant laughter of his younger siblings, everything became a distant echo. All that existed was the letter, the lifeline he had so desperately hoped for. His mother's voice broke through the haze, calling him from the kitchen. "David, what's that you've got there?" He looked up, still in a daze, and walked slowly to where she was standing. She was bent over the stove, stirring something in a pot, her face tired but kind. He handed her the letter without a word. She read it once, then again, her eyes widening with each pass. Finally, she looked up at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and joy. "David, this is incredible. Do you know what this means?" David nodded, but the reality of it still hadn't fully sunk in. "It means I get to go to the academy," he said softly. "It means I have a chance." His mother pulled him into a tight hug, her voice thick with emotion. "You deserve this, David. You've worked so hard for it." But even as she spoke, a small seed of doubt began to take root in David's mind. This scholarship wasn't just a gift, it was an opportunity, yes, but it was also an obligation. It came from Margaret Evans, a woman of immense power and influence, and people like her didn't give without expecting something in return. He shook the thought away, not wanting to dampen the moment. For now, he would allow himself to feel the joy, the relief, and the hope that this letter brought. The future could wait. David's first day at the Elite Academy of the Arts was a blur of unfamiliar faces and intimidating grandeur. The school was everything he had imagined and more. The towering, ivy-covered buildings, the sprawling green lawns, and the pristine marble halls, all of it seemed like something out of a dream. But as he walked through the gates, his sense of awe quickly gave way to a crushing wave of self-doubt. He was keenly aware of how out of place he looked. His clothes, though neat and carefully chosen, couldn't hide the fact that they were worn and unfashionable. The other students, with their designer shoes and confident smiles, barely spared him a glance as they breezed past in small, tight-knit groups. David tried to keep his head up as he navigated the labyrinth of corridors, clutching his schedule like a lifeline. The day passed in a whirlwind of introductions and orientations, each new classroom more imposing than the last. His fellow students seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they were doing, while David felt like he was drowning in a sea of privilege and expectations. It wasn't until lunchtime that he allowed himself a moment to breathe. He found a quiet corner in the expansive dining hall, away from the clamor and chatter of the other students. As he unwrapped the sandwich his mother had packed for him, he couldn't help but feel a pang of loneliness. Just as he was about to take a bite, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see a tall boy with slicked back hair and a practiced smile standing in front of him. "New here, huh?" the boy said, not unkindly. "Mind if I join you?" David nodded, grateful for the company. The boy introduced himself as James, a fellow scholarship student. They talked briefly, with James offering tips on how to survive at the academy. But even as they spoke, David's eyes kept drifting around the room, taking in the cliques and the unspoken hierarchies. He realized with a sinking feeling that this world, with all its wealth and power, was going to be far more difficult to navigate than he had ever imagined. As the bell rang and students began to file out of the hall, David stood up, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. The excitement that had once filled him was now tinged with uncertainty. This was a new world, and he was only just beginning to understand the challenges that lay ahead. David's nerves were on edge as he stood outside Margaret Evans' office. The grandeur of the academy echoed in the stately wood-paneled walls and the heavy door that loomed before him. He had been summoned to meet her after classes, and despite the encouraging words from his new acquaintance James, the knot in his stomach only tightened. A sharp knock echoed in the hallway as he rapped on the door. A moment later, it swung open, revealing a tall, older man with a stern expression. "Miss Evans will see you now," he said, stepping aside to let David enter. The office was exactly as David had imagined it, tastefully furnished with dark mahogany and leather, the scent of old books mingling with that of fresh flowers arranged in a vase on the desk. Behind the desk sat Margaret Evans, poised and elegant, her presence commanding the room. She looked up from the papers she was reviewing and smiled warmly, a gesture that did little to ease David's nerves. "David, please have a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. He did as he was told, trying to ignore the way his hands trembled slightly as he sat down. "First of all, congratulations," Margaret began, her voice smooth and polished. "It's not every day that we come across a student with as much potential as you. I've been following your academic progress for some time, and I'm very pleased that you've accepted our offer." "Thank you, Miss Evans," David replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "I'm very grateful for this opportunity." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying him with a thoughtful expression. "I imagine this must be quite a change for you, coming here," she said. "The academy can be a daunting place, especially for someone from a different background." David nodded, unsure of how to respond. There was something about the way she said "different" that made him feel exposed, as if she could see right through him. "But I have no doubt you'll adapt," Margaret continued, "with the right guidance, of course. That's why I wanted to meet with you personally, to offer my support in any way you need. I'm invested in your success, David, and I intend to see you reach your full potential." Her words were kind, even encouraging, but there was an undercurrent of expectation that David couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a reminder that he was under her watchful eye. He was here because of her, and she held the power to shape his future. "Thank you," David repeated, feeling the weight of her gaze on him. "I won't let you down." "I'm sure you won't," Margaret replied, her smile never wavering. "Now I won't keep you any longer, but remember, my door is always open. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to come to me." David stood up to leave, the knot in his stomach now a dull ache. As he walked out of the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a pact with someone far more powerful than he could comprehend. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity as David tried to settle into his new routine at the academy. Classes were challenging but invigorating, each one pushing him to his limits. Yet, despite the rigorous academic demands, there was something else that occupied his thoughts, his meeting with Margaret Evans. Her words echoed in his mind as he walked through the grand halls, sat in lectures, and even as he studied late into the night. "I'm invested in your success," she had said, but what exactly did that mean? He had felt a deep sense of gratitude when he first received the scholarship, but now that gratitude was tinged with something else: unease. Margaret's presence loomed over him like a shadow. Every decision he made, every step he took, felt as though it were being scrutinized. He began to question himself, wondering if his choices were truly his own, or if they were somehow influenced by the expectations she had subtly set. It didn't help that her influence seemed to permeate every aspect of his life at the academy. Whenever he mentioned her name, professors and students alike reacted with a mixture of respect and fear. It was clear that Margaret Evans was more than just a benefactor. She was a force to be reckoned with. One afternoon, as David was leaving his history class, he found himself lingering outside the library. He knew he should go in and study, but instead, he wandered aimlessly around the campus, his thoughts heavy. The more he tried to focus on his studies, the more his mind drifted back to Margaret. James had warned him about this. "She's a tough one," he had said one day over lunch. "If she's got her eye on you, it means she's expecting a lot. Just be careful not to get too wrapped up in it. You don't want to lose yourself." David had brushed off the warning at the time, telling himself that he was strong enough to handle whatever expectations Margaret might have. But now, he wasn't so sure. The pressure was mounting, and with it, his doubts. Still, he couldn't deny the opportunities that had come his way because of her. The scholarship had opened doors he never could have imagined. He was studying in a place where dreams were made, where the future was bright and full of possibilities. How could he not be grateful? But as he stood there, staring out at the meticulously manicured lawns, a thought crept into his mind. At what cost? Was the price of success worth the growing unease that gnawed at him? And if it wasn't, what could he possibly do about it? With a heavy sigh, David turned and made his way to the library. He had work to do, and for now, that would have to be enough to keep the doubts at bay. But as he settled into his usual spot, opening his textbooks and pulling out his notes, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on a path that was no longer entirely his own. The day started like any other. David arrived at the academy, his mind focused on the upcoming physics exam that loomed large on his schedule. But as he settled into his seat in the classroom, a peculiar feeling of unease began to stir within him. It was the kind of feeling he had learned to ignore over the past few weeks, attributing it to the stress of his new environment and the overwhelming pressure to succeed. But today was different. It wasn't just the stress. There was something more, a quiet sense of dread that seemed to grow with each passing minute. It wasn't until lunchtime that the reason for his unease became clear. As he made his way to the dining hall, David noticed a small group of students gathered near the entrance. Their voices were low, but he caught snatches of their conversation as he passed by. Had to drop out. Apparently, Evans wasn't happy with his performance. "Really? I thought he was one of the top students last year." "Yeah, but you know how it goes. If you don't meet her expectations," David felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to brush it off, telling himself that it was just idle gossip. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and it quickly began to take root. Throughout the rest of the day, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had heard. Was it true? Could Margaret Evans really have that much control over the students she sponsored? And if so, what did that mean for him? The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he actually knew about her. She was a powerful figure, yes, but what did he really know about her motives? Why had she taken such a keen interest in him? That evening, as he sat alone in his dorm room, David found himself staring at the stack of textbooks on his desk. He had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to carve out his own path. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was no longer entirely his own. He picked up one of the books, flipping through the pages without really reading them. His mind was elsewhere, turning over the same questions again and again. What did Margaret want from him? And more importantly, what would happen if he didn't live up to her expectations? For the first time since he had arrived at the academy, David felt truly afraid. Not of failing, he had always been prepared for that possibility, but of what might happen if he succeeded. What would it cost him, and was he willing to pay that price? As the night wore on, David's doubts only grew stronger. He tried to push them aside, to focus on his studies, but it was no use. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was beginning to take hold. In the weeks that followed, David's sense of unease only deepened. Margaret Evans' influence over his life became more palpable with each passing day. It wasn't just in the way she dictated his academic schedule or the extracurricular activities she encouraged him to join. It was in the subtle, almost imperceptible ways she began to shape his entire existence. One evening, after a particularly grueling study session, David received a call from her. It was the first time she had contacted him directly since their initial meeting, and the sound of her voice on the other end of the line sent a shiver down his spine. "David," she said, her tone as smooth as ever, "I've been hearing good things about your progress. I'm pleased to see you're making the most of the opportunities you've been given." "Thank you, Ms. Evans," David replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's something I'd like to discuss with you," she continued. "I've noticed that you haven't been as involved in the Academy's social activities as I would have expected. It's important to cultivate the right connections, David. These relationships will be invaluable to you in the future." David felt a pang of anxiety. He knew she was right. Networking was a crucial part of the Academy experience, but he had been so focused on his studies that he hadn't given it much thought. Still, the idea of socializing with the other students, most of whom came from backgrounds vastly different from his own, was daunting. "I'll do my best to get more involved," he said, though the words felt hollow. "I'm sure you will," Margaret replied, her voice carrying an unspoken expectation. "I've arranged for you to attend a small gathering this weekend at the home of one of the Academy's benefactors. It will be an excellent opportunity for you to meet some of the people who can help you in your future endeavors." David's heart sank. It wasn't a request. It was an order, thinly veiled as a suggestion. He had no choice but to agree, even though the thought of spending an evening with strangers filled him with dread. The days leading up to the event were a blur of anxiety and preparation. Margaret had arranged everything, from his transportation to the clothes he would wear. She left nothing to chance, ensuring that David would present himself exactly as she wanted him to. When the evening finally arrived, David found himself standing in front of a grand, sprawling estate, his nerves on edge. The gathering was as intimidating as he had feared. A sea of well-dressed, confident people who seemed to speak a language all their own. He felt like an outsider, painfully aware of how out of place he was. As the night wore on, David made polite conversation and tried to blend in, but the weight of Margaret's expectations hung over him like a dark cloud. Every word he spoke, every move he made, felt calculated, as if he were playing a role in a carefully scripted play. By the time the event ended, David was exhausted, both physically and mentally. As he rode back to the Academy, he couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could keep this up. Margaret's influence was growing stronger by the day, and with it, his sense of self was slowly slipping away. He had always believed that success would bring him freedom, but now he wasn't so sure. The more he succeeded, the more tightly Margaret's grip seemed to close around him. And as he stared out the window at the passing city lights, David realized with a sinking heart that he was no longer sure where he ended and where Margaret's influence began. David's mind raced as he walked across the Academy's campus, his thoughts a chaotic mix of confusion and fear. The weekend gathering had left him drained. But more than that, it had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about his path forward. Margaret's influence was no longer just a subtle presence in his life. It was a dominating force, shaping his decisions and, by extension, his future. The following week, as he sat in his room, David found himself facing a decision that could alter the course of his life at the Academy. A letter from the dean lay on his desk, its contents clear and direct. He had been offered a prestigious internship at a leading financial firm, a rare opportunity usually reserved for upperclassmen. The catch: the offer had come at the behest of Margaret Evans. David knew what this meant. Accepting the internship would cement his ties to Margaret and the path she had laid out for him. It would open doors to a world of wealth and influence, but would also bind him more tightly to her control. Refusing, however, could mean jeopardizing everything he had worked for: his scholarship, his place at the academy, and his future. He sat there, staring at the letter, weighing his options. On one hand, the internship was a dream come true, a stepping stone to success, financial security, and a future far removed from the hardships of his upbringing. On the other hand, it was a step further into a life that no longer felt like his own, a life dictated by someone else's desires and expectations. David felt a growing sense of frustration. How had he allowed himself to get here? When had he lost control of his own destiny? The questions churned in his mind, feeding the storm of doubt and anxiety that had been building within him for weeks. But as much as he wanted to rebel, to break free from the invisible chains that Margaret had wrapped around him, he knew that the consequences could be severe. He had seen what happened to those who disappointed her, and the prospect of losing everything was too terrifying to contemplate. After what felt like hours of agonizing deliberation, David made his decision. He would accept the internship. It wasn't a choice he made lightly, nor was it one that filled him with excitement or pride. Instead, it was a choice born of necessity, a decision made with the cold logic of survival. As he signed the acceptance letter, his hand trembled slightly. It was a small, almost imperceptible shake, but it carried the weight of a profound realization. He was walking down a path that he hadn't fully chosen, a path that had been laid out for him by someone else. And as he sealed the envelope and placed it in his bag, David knew that this was a crossroad he might never come back from. The decision was made, but the doubts remained, lurking in the back of his mind like shadows. He had chosen the path of least resistance, but at what cost? And as he prepared to hand in the letter, David couldn't help but wonder if he had just taken another step toward losing himself completely. The weeks following David's acceptance of the internship were a whirlwind of new responsibilities and challenges. The financial firm was everything he had expected: fast-paced, demanding, and relentless in its pursuit of excellence. From the moment he walked through the polished glass doors, he was thrust into a world of high stakes and higher expectations. But despite the rigorous demands of the job, it wasn't the work that weighed heaviest on David's mind. It was the constant, inescapable feeling that he was being watched, monitored, even manipulated. Margaret's presence loomed over him, unseen but always felt, like a shadow that stretched across every aspect of his life. It started with small things, suggestions from his supervisor that echoed conversations he had had with Margaret, invitations to exclusive events that seemed too perfectly timed to be coincidental, and chance encounters with influential people who all seemed to know more about him than they should. At first, David dismissed these occurrences as coincidences, but as they became more frequent, he began to see a pattern. Margaret's influence extended far beyond the academy. It was as if she had orchestrated his entire experience at the firm, pulling strings behind the scenes to ensure that everything went exactly as she had planned. The realization sent a chill down David's spine. He had known she was powerful, but this level of control was something else entirely. One afternoon, as David sat at his desk reviewing financial reports, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Margaret. He hesitated before opening it, knowing that whatever she had to say would only tighten her grip on him. "David, I've arranged a meeting for you with one of the firm's senior partners tomorrow. It's an excellent opportunity to discuss your future with the company. Make sure you're prepared." David stared at the message, his heart sinking. He hadn't asked for this meeting, and yet it was being handed to him, another carefully placed piece in the puzzle of his life that Margaret was constructing. He should have been grateful. Any other intern would have jumped at the chance to meet with a senior partner, but all David felt was a deepening sense of unease. As the meeting approached, David found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. His thoughts were consumed by the knowledge that his life was no longer entirely his own. He was being guided, manipulated, and controlled, his every move dictated by an unseen hand that he couldn't escape. The meeting itself was a blur. The senior partner was impressed with David's work, praised his potential, and hinted at a bright future within the firm. But all David could think about was Margaret, her influence, her control, and the power she wielded over him. When the meeting ended, David walked out of the office feeling hollow. The praise and promises that had once filled him with excitement now felt like chains, binding him to a life that he was no longer sure he wanted. As he stepped outside into the cold evening air, he felt a strange sense of disconnection, as if he were watching his own life from a distance, unable to change its course. The city lights flickered around him, and for a moment, David considered running, leaving everything behind and starting anew. But where would he go? What would he do? Margaret's reach was long, and he knew that escaping her influence would be nearly impossible. So, with a heavy heart, David made his way back to the academy, knowing that he was trapped in a web of expectations and obligations that were slowly but surely tightening around him. And as he walked through the grand gates, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer the master of his own fate. The following weeks were a blur of work, study, and the constant presence of Margaret's influence. David's life had become a series of carefully orchestrated steps, each one leading him further down a path he had not chosen. But it wasn't until a late-night study session in the academy's library that he stumbled upon something that would change everything. It was nearly midnight, and the library was nearly empty, the silence broken only by the soft rustle of pages and the occasional click of a keyboard. David was deep into a research project for one of his classes, his eyes bleary from hours of reading, when he noticed an old, leather-bound book tucked away on a high shelf. The title, Philanthropy and Power, The Hidden Influence of Wealth, caught his attention. Curiosity piqued. David reached for the book and carefully opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, the text dense and scholarly. But as he skimmed through the chapters, one name kept appearing: Margaret Evans. The book detailed her rise to power, her numerous philanthropic endeavors, and, more disturbingly, the subtle ways in which she used her wealth and influence to manipulate those around her. David's heart pounded as he read passages that described how Margaret had used her charitable foundation to gain control over various institutions, including the academy. According to the book, she had a history of selecting promising young individuals, offering them scholarships and opportunities, only to mold them into instruments of her will. The author hinted at darker, unspoken deeds, leaving David to wonder just how far Margaret's influence truly extended. He sat there, stunned, as the full weight of what he had discovered began to sink in. This wasn't just about him. Margaret had been doing this for years, to countless others. He wasn't special. He was just another piece in her elaborate game, a pawn to be moved and sacrificed as she saw fit. A cold sweat broke out on David's forehead as he realized the implications of what he had uncovered. Everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, was tainted by Margaret's control. His scholarship, his achievements, even his internship, they were all part of her grand design. For a moment, David considered closing the book, shoving it back on the shelf, and pretending he had never seen it, but he knew he couldn't unlearn what he had just read. The truth was out, and there was no going back. As he closed the book and slipped it into his bag, David's mind raced with questions. What else was she hiding? How many others had suffered because of her? And, most importantly, what could he do to break free from her grasp? The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second feeling like a countdown to a decision David knew he would have to make. He could continue down the path Margaret had laid out for him, ignoring the truth and reaping the rewards of her favor. Or he could take a stand, risking everything to expose the woman who had controlled his life from the shadows. The weight of the choice pressed down on him as he made his way back to his dorm, the book clutched tightly in his hands. He was no longer the naive student who had arrived at the academy with dreams of success. He had seen the truth, and now he had to decide what to do with it. David didn't sleep that night. The revelations from the book haunted him, the pages replaying in his mind as he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through his window, he had made his decision. He couldn't continue living under Margaret's control, not after knowing what she was capable of. The following day, David went through his classes in a daze, his thoughts consumed by the plan forming in his mind. It was risky, reckless even, but he knew he couldn't remain silent. If he did, he would lose himself completely, becoming just another puppet in Margaret's collection. As the afternoon sun dipped low in the sky, David found himself standing outside Margaret Evans' office once again. This time, however, his emotions were a whirlwind of anger and determination, a stark contrast to the nervousness he had felt during their first meeting. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. "Come in," Margaret's voice called from inside. David entered, his expression grim. Margaret looked up from her desk, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his demeanor. "David," she said, her tone neutral, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" He wasted no time with pleasantries. "I know what you've been doing," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Margaret's expression didn't change, but David saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, or maybe annoyance. "I'm not sure what you mean," she replied, her tone calm. "I'm talking about your so-called philanthropy," David continued, his voice rising. "I know how you've been using your foundation to manipulate people, to control their lives. I'm not going to let you do that to me." There was a long silence as Margaret regarded him, her gaze unreadable. Then, slowly, she leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "David, you're upset. I understand that. But you need to be very careful about the accusations you're making. You've been given opportunities that most people could only dream of. Everything I've done has been to help you succeed." "Help me succeed?" David echoed, incredulous. "You've been controlling me, shaping me into whatever you want me to be. That's not help, that's manipulation." Margaret's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "And what do you think you're going to do about it, David? You're here because of me. Your entire future depends on my support. Are you really willing to throw all of that away?" The question hung in the air, a challenge that cut to the core of David's resolve, but he didn't back down. "If it means I get to decide my own life, then yes. I'd rather lose everything than continue being your pawn." For a moment, Margaret said nothing, her eyes locked on David's. Then, slowly, she nodded, as if coming to some internal decision. "Very well," she said, her voice cold and measured. "But remember this, David. The choices you make now will determine the rest of your life. I hope you're prepared to live with the consequences." With that, she turned her attention back to the papers on her desk, a clear dismissal. David stood there for a moment longer, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the office. the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in his mind. As he stepped out into the hallway, the weight of what he had just done hit him full force. He had defied Margaret Evans, something few had ever dared to do. The consequences would be severe, he had no doubt, but for the first time in weeks, David felt a sense of freedom. He had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life, and there was no turning back now. The days following David's confrontation with Margaret Evans were filled with a tense silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. David had expected immediate repercussions, maybe even an outright revocation of his scholarship, but instead there was nothing, no word from Margaret, no sudden changes to his schedule, no confrontations with the dean. Just silence. But the silence was anything but reassuring. It hung over him like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of something terrible just beyond the horizon. And as the days turned into a week, David found himself growing more anxious, his nerves frayed by the anticipation of an unseen blow. His fears were confirmed one afternoon when he received a summons to the dean's office. The message was brief and to the point, offering no clues as to the nature of the meeting. But David knew, deep down, that this was it, the beginning of whatever retaliation Margaret had planned. As he walked to the dean's office, his mind raced with possibilities. Would he be expelled? Would his internship be revoked? Would Margaret use her influence to ruin his reputation, ensuring he could never rebuild what he had lost? The dean's office was a stark contrast to Margaret's, a functional, no-nonsense space with little in the way of personal touches. The dean himself was a stern man in his 60s, his face lined with years of academic administration. He gestured for David to sit down without preamble. "David," the dean began, his voice as severe as his expression, "I've received some concerning reports about your behavior." David's heart sank. "Reports?" The dean nodded. "It has come to my attention that you've been less than cooperative with some of the opportunities provided to you. Specifically, your attitude towards Miss Evans." David felt a rush of anger and frustration. So this was how it was going to be. Margaret wasn't going to confront him directly. She was going to dismantle his life piece by piece, starting with his standing at the academy. "I don't know what you've heard," David began carefully, "but I believe I'm entitled to make my own decisions about my future." The dean's eyes narrowed. "And those decisions, David, must align with the expectations set by those who have invested in you. Ms. Evans has been very generous, but generosity is not without its expectations." There it was, the warning, wrapped in the language of obligation and expectation. Margaret was reminding him, through the dean, that she held all the cards, and if David wasn't willing to play by her rules, she could pull the rug out from under him at any moment. "I understand," David replied, his voice tight, "but with all due respect, I'm trying to find my own way." The dean's gaze hardened. "Be very careful, David. The path you're choosing is a dangerous one, and there's no guarantee of what lies at the end." David nodded, understanding the implicit threat. The meeting was over, and as he left the dean's office, the reality of his situation began to settle in. He had defied Margaret, and now the consequences were beginning to take shape. His place at the academy was no longer secure, and the future he had once dreamed of seemed to be slipping through his fingers. But despite the fear gnawing at him, David couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. He had taken a stand, and even though the consequences were severe, he knew he had done the right thing. The question now was how far Margaret was willing to go to bring him back under her control, and how much he was willing to sacrifice to stay free. The days following the meeting with the dean were some of the loneliest David had ever experienced. It wasn't just that his friends seemed to be avoiding him, or that the professors were suddenly less accommodating. It was the growing realization that he was being systematically isolated. Margaret's reach was far longer than he had ever imagined, and she was using it to tighten the noose around him. At first, it was subtle. Invitations to social events and study groups that once came frequently began to dry up. Conversations that he was a part of would fall silent when he approached, only to resume once he moved away. The few friends he had made at the academy seemed to be distancing themselves, their interactions with him growing increasingly guarded and brief. David couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was behind it all. She was making sure that he understood the cost of his defiance, that he felt the full weight of the isolation she was imposing. It was a slow, methodical punishment, designed to break him down bit by bit until he had no choice but to return to her fold. The pressure only grew as the weeks went on. His grades, once impeccable, began to slip. He found it harder to concentrate in class, his mind constantly racing with thoughts of what Margaret might do next. The stress was taking its toll, both physically and mentally, and there were nights when David lay awake in bed, his chest tight with anxiety, unable to sleep. He had expected retaliation, but not like this. He had prepared himself for a fight, for a direct confrontation with Margaret, but instead she was dismantling his life piece by piece in ways that he couldn't directly challenge or resist. It was as if she were playing a game of chess, moving pieces around the board while he struggled to keep up. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, David found himself sitting alone in the student lounge, staring at his phone. He had considered calling his mother, telling her everything that was happening, but what could she do? This was a battle he had to fight on his own. As he sat there, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from James, the friend who had first warned him about Margaret's influence. "David, we need to talk. Meet me at the usual spot." David's heart leaped at the thought of having someone to confide in, someone who understood what he was going through. He quickly gathered his things and made his way to the small cafe just off campus where they usually met. When he arrived, James was already there, sitting in their usual booth at the back. But as David approached, he noticed that James's expression was tense, almost nervous. "What's going on?" David asked as he slid into the booth. James glanced around, making sure they weren't overheard before leaning in. "David, you're in trouble." "More trouble than you realize," David frowned. "What do you mean?" "Margaret. She's not just trying to isolate you," James said quietly. "She's going to ruin you. I've heard things from people who work for her. She's pulling every string she can to make sure you have no future here, no future anywhere." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. He had known that Margaret was powerful, that she was vindictive, but hearing it confirmed like this made it all too real. "What do I do?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James shook his head, his expression pained. "I don't know, man. I just thought you should know what you're up against." David nodded, his mind reeling. The walls were closing in, and he was running out of options. The pressure was mounting, and with each passing day, he felt his resolve weakening. Margaret was winning, and unless he found a way to fight back, he knew it was only a matter of time before she crushed him completely. The conversation with James lingered in David's mind, adding to the already heavy weight of his isolation. Margaret's power seemed insurmountable, but David knew that if he was going to survive this, he had to regain some semblance of control over his own life. He needed to prove to himself that he wasn't entirely at her mercy. It was this resolve that drove him to take a small but significant step toward autonomy. David decided to skip one of the events Margaret had arranged for him, a networking dinner with influential alumni. It was a calculated risk, one that filled him with both fear and a newfound sense of defiance. If Margaret was watching, and David was sure she was, this would send a clear message. He was not her puppet. Instead of attending the dinner, David took the evening to himself. He found a quiet spot in the city's botanical gardens, a place he had discovered during one of his rare moments of solitude. The gardens were a sanctuary, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. Here he could breathe freely, away from the pressures of the academy and the ever-present shadow of Margaret's influence. As he walked along the winding paths, David felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for weeks. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was doing something entirely for himself. No obligations, no expectations, just the simple pleasure of being alone with his thoughts. He found a bench near a small pond and sat down, watching as the water reflected the deepening colors of the evening sky. The tranquility of the scene allowed his mind to drift, and he began to think about the future, his future. What would it look like if he could break free from Margaret's control? Could he build a life that was truly his own, even if it meant giving up everything she had given him? The questions were daunting, but for the first time in weeks, David didn't feel overwhelmed by them. Instead, he felt a spark of hope, a glimmer of possibility that he hadn't allowed himself to consider until now. Perhaps he could find a way out, a way to reclaim his life without completely destroying the future he had worked so hard to build. As the evening wore on, David knew that this small act of rebellion wouldn't go unnoticed. Margaret would certainly have something to say about it, and there would likely be consequences. But as he stood up and made his way back to the academy, he felt a sense of resolve solidifying within him. He had taken a step, however small, toward reclaiming his autonomy, and that alone gave him the strength to face whatever came next. When he returned to his dorm that night, David was met with silence. No angry messages, no immediate retaliation. It was as if Margaret was waiting, watching to see what he would do next. But David knew that the absence of immediate consequences didn't mean he was in the clear. He had defied her again, and sooner or later she would make her move. But for now, as he lay in bed and drifted off to sleep, David allowed himself to feel a quiet victory. He had made a choice for himself, and no matter what came next, that was something Margaret could never take away from him. The following day, David awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The night in the gardens had given him clarity, and he was determined to find a way to sever the strings Margaret had attached to his life. But he knew that doing so would require more than just defiance. It would require understanding the full extent of her influence and the true nature of her agenda. David decided to start by digging deeper into the connections between Margaret and the academy. If she had used her power to control him, it was likely she had done the same to others. He needed to know who else was under her thumb and how she was pulling the strings. During a break between classes, David headed to the library, where he had found the book that first revealed Margaret's manipulative ways. This time, he focused his search on more specific information, financial records, board minutes, and anything that might shed light on the relationships between Margaret and the Academy's leadership. It didn't take long for David to find what he was looking for. In a dusty archive of old documents, he discovered records that painted a clear picture of Margaret's influence. She wasn't just a benefactor, she was a silent partner in nearly every major decision the Academy had made over the past decade. Her foundation had provided substantial funding for new buildings, scholarships, and research programs, all of which had given her an unofficial but undeniable power over the institution. But what was more troubling were the personal connections she had cultivated with key figures within the Academy. The dean, several department heads, and even members of the student council all had ties to Margaret, either through financial support or personal favors. It was clear that her influence extended far beyond the surface, and those who opposed her often found themselves facing sudden obstacles, unexplained setbacks, or, in some cases, quietly removed from their positions. As David pieced together the web of influence Margaret had woven, he realized just how deep her control ran. She had built a system that allowed her to shape the lives of those around her, ensuring that they remained loyal to her interests or suffered the consequences. The implications were staggering. If Margaret had gone to such lengths to maintain control over the academy, what else was she capable of? And more importantly, how could David possibly fight back against someone with so much power? His mind raced with possibilities, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who were either outside of Margaret's influence or willing to take a stand against her. But finding those people would be no easy task, especially when trust was in such short supply. David's thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. He pulled it out to see a message from an unknown number. The message was brief, but its content sent a shiver down his spine. "We need to talk, tonight, same place as last time." David's first instinct was to ignore it. He had enough to worry about without adding mysterious messages to the mix. But something about the timing and the fact that whoever it was knew about his previous meeting with James made him reconsider. As the day wore on, David's curiosity and unease grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to everything he had uncovered, and that whoever had sent the message might hold the key to unraveling Margaret's agenda. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David found himself once again walking toward the small cafe off campus. He had no idea who he was about to meet or what they wanted, but one thing was certain. The more he uncovered about Margaret's hidden agenda, the more dangerous his situation became. As David approached the small cafe off campus, his heart pounded with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. The streets were quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of the day replaced by the soft hum of distant traffic. He scanned the area nervously, half expecting to see Margaret's shadow lurking somewhere nearby, but the night remained still, and he took a deep breath before stepping inside. The cafe was dimly lit, with only a few patrons scattered across the room. David's eyes quickly adjusted to the darkness as he searched for the person who had summoned him. In the far corner, partially hidden by the shadows, he spotted a figure who was unmistakably waiting for him. As he approached, the figure raised a hand in a subtle wave. David recognized him immediately. It was James. But something was different about him tonight. Gone was the easygoing demeanor. In its place was a look of tension and concern. "James," David greeted him as he slid into the seat across from him. "What's going on? Why all the secrecy?" James leaned in, lowering his voice. "David, I didn't want to talk about this over the phone. It's too risky. Margaret, she's got eyes and ears everywhere." David nodded, already aware of the extent of Margaret's reach. "What did you find out?" James glanced around the room, making sure no one was paying them any attention. "I've been digging into her background, trying to find out more about her connections and how she operates. What I found, it's bad, David. Really bad." He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket, flipping through the pages before sliding it across the table to David. "Take a look at this." David opened the notebook, his eyes scanning the pages filled with scribbled notes and diagrams. It was a detailed account of Margaret's network, her allies, her enemies, and the methods she used to maintain control. But what caught David's attention was the list of names, many of whom were current and former students of the academy. "These are the people she's targeted over the years," James explained. "She picks them out, just like she did with you, and then she uses them to further her own agenda. Some of them made it out, but most, well, they didn't." David felt a chill run down his spine as he read the names. Some he recognized as successful alumni, while others had mysteriously dropped out or disappeared from public view. It was a pattern, a carefully orchestrated plan that Margaret had perfected over the years. "This is..." "This is insane," David muttered, his mind racing. "She's been doing this for so long, and no one stopped her." James shook his head. "No one's even tried. She's too powerful, and anyone who goes up against her either falls in line or gets destroyed." "But that's not the worst part." David looked up, dreading what was coming next. "What do you mean?" James hesitated, then leaned in even closer. "There's a reason she's so interested in you, David. It's not just because you're talented or because you have potential. It's because of your background, where you come from, your family. There's something she sees in you that she wants to control, to mold into her own image." David's stomach turned as the implications of James's words sank in. Margaret's interest in him had always seemed too personal, too intense. Now, it made a twisted kind of sense. She didn't just want to help him succeed. She wanted to shape him into something that suited her own goals. "What do we do?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James leaned back, his expression grim. "We need to be smart about this. We can't take her on directly, but if we gather enough evidence, we might be able to expose her. But it's risky, David. You need to be sure you're willing to go all the way." David nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm in. Whatever it takes. I'm not going to let her control my life any longer." James gave a tight-lipped smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Then let's get to work." The days that followed were a whirlwind of secretive meetings and whispered conversations. David and James began to systematically gather evidence against Margaret, carefully documenting her connections, her manipulations, and the long trail of students whose lives she had shaped or destroyed. Each new piece of information added to the growing sense of urgency that had taken hold of David. They were playing a dangerous game, and one wrong move could bring everything crashing down. David found it increasingly difficult to focus on his studies, his mind constantly distracted by the weight of what they were uncovering. He still attended classes, still went through the motions of his life at the academy, but it all felt hollow. His real work was happening in the shadows, where every decision could have life-altering consequences. As the pieces of Margaret's puzzle began to fall into place, David started to see the full scope of her influence. She wasn't just manipulating a few students. She had her hands in nearly every aspect of the academy's operations. From the Board of Trustees to the Student Council, Margaret's reach was everywhere, ensuring that her vision for the future was the one that prevailed. But as they delved deeper, the risks grew higher. David began to notice strange things. Students who seemed to be watching him, faculty members who gave him sidelong glances, and conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. The pressure was mounting, and the fear that Margaret might catch wind of their investigation loomed large. One afternoon, as David sat in the library, poring over a stack of documents James had managed to obtain, he felt a presence behind him. He looked up to see one of his professors, a stern woman who had always seemed indifferent to his presence, standing over him with a curious expression. "David," she said, her voice calm but probing, "you've been spending a lot of time in the library lately. Everything all right?" David forced a smile, his heart racing. "Just trying to stay on top of things," he replied, hoping his voice didn't betray his anxiety. The professor nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the documents on the table. "Good, it's important to stay focused. But remember, balance is key. Don't overextend yourself." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving David with a cold sweat trickling down his back. It was a simple interaction, but it felt loaded with hidden meaning. Was she genuinely concerned, or was she sending a message? And if she was, who had sent her? As the weeks wore on, David found himself growing increasingly paranoid. Every glance, every conversation, every seemingly innocuous interaction felt like it held a double meaning. Was he being watched? Was Margaret aware of what they were doing? The stress was becoming unbearable, and more than once, David considered abandoning the plan altogether. But each time the thought crossed his mind, he remembered the faces in James's notebook, the students who had been used and discarded, their lives twisted by Margaret's machinations. He couldn't turn back now, not when they were so close to exposing the truth. One evening, as David and James met in a secluded corner of the campus to review their findings, James handed him a folder. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "Everything we need to take her down. But we need to be careful. If she finds out we have this—" David took the folder, feeling its weight in his hands. Inside were the documents that could expose Margaret for what she truly was, a manipulator, a puppet master pulling the strings of countless lives. But the risk was immense. If they failed, it wouldn't just be their futures at stake. It could mean the end of everything they had worked for. "We need to be smart about this," James continued. "We can't go to the authorities directly. We need to find someone who's outside of her influence, someone who can take this and run with it without getting crushed." David nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. There had to be someone out there who could help them, someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to Margaret. But time was running out, and with each passing day, the danger grew. As they parted ways that night, David felt the weight of the folder like a leaden anchor pulling him down. The unraveling had begun, and there was no turning back now. But as he made his way back to his dorm, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from disaster. The tension between David and the world around him reached a breaking point in the days following the discovery of the incriminating documents. Each step he took felt like a walk through a minefield, every glance or whispered word a potential harbinger of his undoing. But nothing could have prepared him for the betrayal that would come from within his own circle. It was a cold, grey afternoon when David received a message from James asking him to meet at the usual cafe. The message was brief, its tone urgent, and it left David with a gnawing sense of unease as he made his way there. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the careful plan they had been constructing was about to fall apart. When David arrived, the cafe was nearly empty, the usual warmth of the place replaced by an eerie stillness. James was already seated in their corner booth, his expression tense, his eyes flicking nervously around the room. "James, what's going on?" David asked as he slid into the seat across from him. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "David, I don't know how to say this, but we've been compromised." David's heart skipped a beat. "Compromised? What do you mean?" James looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "Someone found out about our plan. They came to me last night, told me that if I didn't back off, they'd ruin me. They knew everything, David, every detail, every move we've made." David felt the blood drain from his face. Who found out?" James shook his head. "I don't know, they didn't say, but it doesn't matter, David. We're exposed. If we keep going, we're going to lose everything." David's mind raced, trying to process the implications. "So what are you saying? We just give up? Let Margaret win?" James sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm saying we need to think about our futures. We can't beat her, David. She's too powerful. She's got everyone in her pocket. And now she knows we're onto her. If we push this any further, she'll destroy us." David stared at him, disbelief and anger boiling within him. "So that's it, you're just going to walk away?" James didn't meet his gaze. "I have no choice. They made it clear. If I don't stop, they'll come after my family. I can't let that happen, David. I'm sorry." The betrayal hit David like a physical blow, the realization that he was now truly alone in this fight. The person he had trusted, the only ally he had, was abandoning him. And worse, Margaret, or whoever was pulling the strings, had won, at least for now. David stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't believe you're doing this," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You were supposed to be on my side." James finally looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, David. I really am, but I have to protect what's left of my life. I hope you understand." David didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the cafe, the weight of the betrayal settling heavily on his shoulders. The world outside was just as cold and grey as it had been when he arrived, but now it felt even more oppressive, as if the very air around him was conspiring to crush him. As he made his way back to the academy, David's thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, fear, and despair. He had been so close to exposing Margaret, so close to breaking free from her control, but now, with James gone and the threat of retaliation hanging over him, the path forward seemed more treacherous than ever. Yet even in the depths of his despair, a spark of defiance remained. Margaret may have won this round, but David wasn't ready to surrender just yet. He would find another way, even if it meant going it alone. The days following James's betrayal were some of the darkest David had ever known. He felt like a man adrift, cut off from the one person who had shared his struggle against Margaret's influence. Every step he took through the academy's halls felt like a walk through enemy territory, each glance from a fellow student or professor a potential threat. David tried to go about his routine, attending classes and working on assignments, but his heart wasn't in it. The weight of the secrets he carried, coupled with the fear of imminent exposure, pressed down on him like a heavy blanket, smothering any sense of normalcy. But despite the overwhelming pressure, David knew he couldn't give up. James's departure had left him alone, but it had also sharpened his resolve. If he was going to take on Margaret, he needed to be smarter, more careful. He couldn't afford any more mistakes. Late one evening, as he sat in his dorm room, staring blankly at his textbooks, a thought struck him. He had been trying to gather evidence against Margaret, to build a case that could bring her down. But maybe he had been going about it the wrong way. Instead of focusing on her connections and manipulations, perhaps he needed to look at her more personally, to understand what drove her, what her weaknesses might be. With renewed determination, David turned to his laptop and began researching Margaret's history. He combed through old news articles, interviews, and public records, piecing together a timeline of her rise to power. What he found was a story of ambition, wealth, and influence, but also one of secrecy, carefully controlled narratives, and gaps that raised more questions than answers. The more he dug, the more he realized that Margaret's life was not as spotless as it appeared. There were hints of scandal, rumors that had been quickly buried, and business dealings that had ended abruptly with little explanation. But it was one particular name that caught his attention, a name that seemed to appear and disappear from her life with unsettling frequency. Richard Langley. David found only sparse information about Langley, an enigmatic figure connected to several of Margaret's early ventures. But the more he searched, the more he became convinced that Langley held a key to understanding Margaret's true nature. Something about their relationship seemed pivotal, as if it had shaped the course of her life and, by extension, the lives of those she controlled. But Langley had vanished from public records nearly a decade ago, leaving behind only whispers and speculation. If David was going to find out more, he would have to dig deeper, beyond what was easily accessible. He spent hours that night, combing through every scrap of information he could find, until finally he stumbled upon an old newspaper article from a small town several states away. The article mentioned a Richard Langley in connection with a real estate project that had gone sour, an abandoned development that had caused a minor local scandal before being quietly hushed up. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. And more importantly, it was something Margaret couldn't easily control. If David could find out what had happened between her and Langley, he might finally have the leverage he needed to turn the tables. The next day, David skipped his classes and caught a bus to the small town where the article had been published. The journey was long and exhausting, but his determination kept him going. When he arrived, he headed straight for the local library, hoping to find more information in the archives. Hours passed as he sifted through old newspapers, but eventually his perseverance paid off. He found a series of articles detailing the fallout of the failed development, along with a photograph that sent a shock of recognition through him. The man standing next to Margaret in the photo was unmistakably Richard Langley, though he looked far older and more worn than David had expected. But what caught David's attention wasn't just the photograph, it was the headline beneath it. Local developer disappears amid financial scandal. Foul play suspected. David's heart raced as he realized the significance of what he had found. Langley hadn't just vanished, he had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and Margaret had been involved. This was more than just a failed business deal. This was a cover-up, one that Margaret had likely orchestrated to protect herself. With this new information in hand, David knew he had found the turning point he had been searching for. If he could uncover the truth about what happened to Langley, he might finally have the power to bring Margaret down. But he also knew that pursuing this would be dangerous, perhaps even more dangerous than anything he had faced before. As David left the library that evening, the cold air biting at his skin, he felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. He was on the verge of something big, something that could change everything. But the stakes had never been higher, and one wrong move could mean losing everything he had left. David returned to the academy with a renewed sense of purpose, but also a deep-seated fear gnawing at him. The discovery about Richard Langley was a significant breakthrough, but it was also a dangerous piece of information. If Margaret had covered up Langley's disappearance, it meant she was willing to go to any lengths to protect herself. And now, David was holding the very thread that could unravel her carefully constructed life. Sitting in his dorm room, David reviewed the information he had gathered, his mind racing with possibilities. The connection between Margaret and Langley was the key to exposing her, but he knew that simply having this information wasn't enough. He needed a plan. One that would not only reveal the truth, but also protect him from the inevitable backlash. David's thoughts turned to the media. A story like this, if handled correctly, could be explosive, but he also knew that going to the wrong outlet could backfire spectacularly. Margaret's reach extended far, and she likely had allies in the media who could spin the story in her favor or bury it entirely. He needed to find a journalist who was outside her sphere of influence, someone with a reputation for integrity and a willingness to take on powerful figures. After hours of research, David identified a potential ally, Sarah Whitaker, an investigative journalist known for her work exposing corruption and cover-ups. She had a reputation for going after untouchable figures and was based in a city far enough from Margaret's immediate influence that she might be able to operate without interference. The decision to contact Sarah was a gamble, but David knew it was his best shot. He drafted a careful, anonymous email outlining the basics of what he had uncovered and hinting at the larger story involving Margaret. He attached copies of the documents he had gathered, including the old newspaper articles about Langley, and sent the email with a mix of hope and trepidation. The next few days were agonizingly slow as David waited for a response. He continued to attend classes, though his concentration was elsewhere, constantly checking his phone for any sign that Sarah had received his message. Each day that passed without a reply felt like a weight pressing down on him, the anxiety building to a nearly unbearable level. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Sarah. "I've read your message. Meet me in person tomorrow at 10 a.m. Southside Diner. Come alone." The brevity of the email left David with more questions than answers, but it also brought a sense of relief. She had taken the bait. Now, all he had to do was follow through with the meeting and hope that Sarah was the ally he needed. The next morning, David arrived at the diner early, nerves on edge as he scanned the room for Sarah. The diner was a small, unassuming place, the kind of spot where people came for a quiet meal without much fuss. He had chosen a booth in the back, his eyes constantly flicking to the door. At precisely 10 a.m., a woman in her late 30s walked in, her sharp eyes immediately finding him. She was dressed casually, but there was an air of confidence about her that marked her as someone who knew how to command a room. She walked over to David's booth and slid into the seat opposite him. "David, I presume?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. David nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes, you must be Sarah." She gave a curt nod, pulling out a small notebook and a pen. "Let's get straight to the point. You've uncovered something big, and I'm willing to help you, but I need to know everything. Start from the beginning." David took a deep breath and began recounting the entire story. Margaret's influence, the manipulation, the discovery of Richard Langley, and the documents he had found. Sarah listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes, her expression giving nothing away. When he finished, Sarah leaned back in her seat, considering him carefully. "This is serious. If what you're saying is true, it could blow the lid off her entire operation, but you need to understand the risks. Once this story goes public, there's no going back. Are you prepared for that?" David hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I don't have a choice. She's already ruined too many lives. I can't let her get away with it." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. "All right, I'll start digging into this and see what I can uncover. But be careful, David. If she finds out what we're doing, she'll come after you with everything she's got." David nodded, his resolve firm. "I understand." As they parted ways, David felt a mix of fear and determination. The plan was in motion, but the real battle was just beginning. In the days following his meeting with Sarah, the atmosphere around David grew increasingly tense. The pressure was building, and he knew it was only a matter of time before Margaret became aware of his actions. Each day felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation, and the weight of what he had set in motion pressed heavily on him. True to her word, Sarah worked quickly. Within a week, she had contacted David again, this time with a request for more details. She had begun to dig into Margaret's past and had uncovered enough to confirm that something was indeed amiss. But to fully expose the story, she needed more. A smoking gun that would leave no room for doubt. David did his best to provide what she needed, combing through every piece of information he had. But the more they uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. It wasn't long before David began to notice a change in the way people at the academy interacted with him. Conversations would stop abruptly when he entered a room, and there were whispers that followed him down the hallways. He could feel the walls closing in, the pressure building to a breaking point. Then, one afternoon, as David was leaving the library, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He checked the screen and felt his heart skip a beat. It was Margaret. He hesitated for a moment before answering, bracing himself for what was to come. "Hello? David." Margaret's voice was smooth and controlled, but there was an undercurrent of steel in her tone. "I think it's time we had a little chat. Come to my office immediately." David's stomach twisted into knots. There was no mistaking the urgency in her voice. She knew. He didn't bother replying. Instead, he turned on his heel and made his way across campus, each step heavier than the last. When he arrived at Margaret's office, the door was already open, as if she had been expecting him. He stepped inside, the familiar scent of leather and polished wood doing nothing to calm his nerves. Margaret was seated behind her desk, her expression unreadable. She gestured for him to sit, and he did so, feeling the weight of her gaze on him. "David," she began, her voice deceptively calm, "I've always been invested in your success. I've given you opportunities that most people can only dream of. But lately, I've been hearing disturbing things that make me question your loyalty." David's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I don't know what you mean." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, a hint of danger in her gaze. "Don't play games with me, David. I know what you've been up to. You've been working with that journalist, trying to dig up dirt on me. Do you really think you can betray me and walk away unscathed?" David swallowed hard, his mind racing for a response. "I'm not trying to betray you. I'm just trying to understand what's really going on." Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to a cold, almost threatening whisper. "Let me make this clear. You are playing with fire. If you continue down this path, you will get burned. I have the power to ruin you, David. Your scholarship, your future, everything you've worked for, it can all disappear in an instant." David felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he kept his voice steady. "You've already ruined so many lives, Margaret. I can't just stand by and let you do it to more people." Margaret's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing to slits. "You're making a grave mistake, David. I've given you everything, and this is how you repay me, by trying to destroy me." David met her gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm trying to stop you from destroying others. You've gone too far, and it's time someone stood up to you." For a moment, the room was filled with a tense, suffocating silence. Then Margaret slowly stood up, her eyes never leaving David's. "This is your final warning. Stop this nonsense now, or I will make you regret it. You have no idea what I'm capable of." David stood as well, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. "I'm not afraid of you, Margaret. Do whatever you have to do, but I'm not backing down." Margaret's lips curled into a cold, humorless smile. "Very well, but don't say I didn't warn you." With that, David turned and walked out of the office, his heart hammering in his chest. The ultimatum had been delivered, and the lines were now clearly drawn. Margaret was going to come after him with everything she had, and he would have to be ready to face the full force of her wrath. As he stepped out into the cold air, David knew there was no turning back. The final showdown was coming, and it would determine not just his future, but the futures of everyone Margaret had touched. He had made his choice, and now he would have to live with the consequences. Click on the video on your screen to continue until the end. The continuation link is in the description of this video too.